You're listening to the Doctor Is In podcast, brought to you by MartinClinic.com. During the episode, the doctors share a lot of information. As awesome as the info may be, it is not intended to diagnose, cure, treat, or prevent any disease. It's strictly for informational purposes.
Hello, I'm Dr. Martin Jr.
I'm Dr. Martin Sr.
And this is the Doctors In podcast, and this is episode 206. Today we want to go a little bit deeper into something that we talked about last night. We had a live webinar. It was called Where to Start If You Want to Feel Fantastic Again. And today we want to kind of go through some of the stuff that we talked about during that live webinar and then share a little bit of stuff, a little bit of different stuff as well for those that were on the webinar that are going to listen to this episode. But one of the things that we get asked a lot is, all right, where do I start? That's such a common question. Yeah. And it makes sense, right? It's like, okay, I'm interested in getting better, or I'm interested in feeling better. I'm interested in getting my energy back, but I don't know where to start. That's such a common, and it completely makes sense, right? And we always like to, you go to a mall or, anywhere, but a mall a lot of times too, right? You walk in, especially if it's a mall you're not used to. I remember we were at Mall of America, not too long ago. And, you walk in, this place is massive. I mean, it's just huge.
Yeah.
And you walk in and you're like, all right, everybody has the different areas they want to hit. So you walk in, you look, you find the big board and you're like, all right, where is everything? But it's very helpful that there's a little X or a little circle that says you are here, right? Yeah. This is where you're at now. It's much easier to look at a map where when you know where you're at. Then you can say, okay, I want to go to this destination, so I'm here. I have to do this. I have to go right, straight, and all that stuff. But when you don't know where you're at, it's very hard to get anywhere if you don't know where you're at right now. So one of the things that we like to do is always help people first figure out exactly where they're at. Yeah. Because once you know where you're at, then when it comes to starting, then you know how strict, you know how serious, you know how long, all those kind of things. It's easier to answer those questions, because another question we get asked a lot is, well, how long do I have to do this for? And then our question back to them is, well, where are you at right now? Where, have you been diagnosed with something? Like that's a loaded question. There's a lot of context that needs to be answered. So one of the things we want to do today is help you, if you're listening to this episode, know where's the best place to start, or and especially where are you right now on this road from health to disease, because
it is a path. It's definitely a road, right?
Well, you always say it. You don't go to bed healthy tonight and wake up with a disease tomorrow. That's a fact, right?
Yeah.
100,000 plus patient visits, 46 years of practice, and you always say this. There's nobody that goes to bed, healthy tonight with a disease tomorrow. Now, you like to point out we're not talking about bacterial infection, because you can go to bed healthy tonight and wake up with a...
Yeah, you got a flu tomorrow, right?
That's
you got
right.
a bug. That's different.
But we're talking disease.
Yeah, and when we talk about disease, and we'll hit this because we're going to go through this a little bit, but on our podcast, we're always talking about a condition called inflammation. So I like what you said years ago, it's not infection, it's disease without a fever, right?
Yeah, today inflammation is the new fever, right? Prior to the 50s, really, the number one killers back then were all infection-based stuff. Mm-hmm. That was the top killers. Then, as antibiotics came out and all those things came out, infection deaths went down. But now we're seeing the top killers, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, all those things they're non-infection-based killers.
Yeah.
And it used to be if you were sick, you got a fever, especially if, a lot of these foreign invaders would trigger a fever. And a fever meant that your body was working, it was doing its job.
Immune system, right?
That's right. It meant that it identified a problem and your body was mounting its defense. A fever is your body mounting its defense. And a fever, I heard somebody say this. I heard years ago this one professor saying, fever is like it charges your white blood cells. It's like charging your white blood cells. And it's fascinating, right? But now, so you used to know if you had a fever, you would know, there's something wrong with you. But today, because we're dealing with inflammation, the body doesn't give you a fever when you got heart disease coming. It doesn't give you a fever when you got diabetes coming. It doesn't work the same way.
Yeah, for cancer.
So inflammation is what they call a lot of times the silent killer. However, the second part of the truth, so the first truth is you don't go to bed healthy tonight, wake up with a disease tomorrow. The second part of that equation is the body will give you clues as you move from health towards disease. It's just that a lot of times we don't pay attention to the clues, or we're not associating the clues with what's coming.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to also talk about today. The body definitely gives warning signs. We like to tell the story of the Titanic. You know, it's fascinating because
I always love that story.
Yeah, most people are not aware of the fact that the Titanic got a lot of warnings not to go where it was going. Yeah. And in fact,
change course.
I think was it the U.S. California, I think it was in the area exactly where the Titanic was going. And they actually warned the Titanic multiple times. And then I think the last communication between the two ships was basically the radio person saying, you know, shut up, I'm tired, because they've been hearing it all day. And that was the end of it. And then obviously we know what happened, right? So it's not like the Titanic didn't have warnings. It just chose not to listen to them. And that's the body's doing the same thing. It's given warnings. It's given distress signals. Yeah. It's giving clues. But a lot of times they're so vague. It doesn't make any sense. So we're going to help. We're going to hopefully help with that as well in today's episode. Yeah. Now, one of the things that we like to do is we want you right now. It doesn't matter where you're at right now, whatever age you're at. I want you to picture how you envision your 70s, 80s, and 90s. So wherever you're at now.
60s?
60s. Well, then you want to think about your 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Right. I'm thinking 70s.
Yeah.
Somebody that's 50s thinking 60s, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like, I'm talking about in the future.
Yeah.
How do you envision finishing off your life? That's what I'm talking about. So where you're at now, it doesn't matter your age. How are you going to finish off your 70s and 80s and 90s? Because that's what a lot of people would consider senior citizens type of thing. How are you going to finish that? Yeah. I want you to think about that for a second, because what ends up happening is this. Think of now the ideal situation, right? How would you like to see yourself in the 70s and 80s and 90s? Well, I think most people would say, well, I'd like to have good energy.
For sure.
I'd like to be able to move around, right? I want to be able to get up out of a chair. I don't want to have help everywhere I go. I want to be able to get out and drive or get out and walk. And Brain's a big one.
I think that's the biggest one people
I think that's becoming the number one fear that people have, that their body is going to outlive their brain.
And we talked a lot about that.
So that's another thing. They want their heart to be strong. They'll say, I want strong bones. They want to be sleeping properly. So that's ideal, right? So now you thought of your ideal. Now let's talk about what would be less than ideal. What would be a bad outcome? Well, you get diagnosed with heart disease. You start to get dementia or sarcopenia, for example, or osteoporosis. You have no energy, or you get diagnosed with cancer. That would be a less than ideal.
So
obviously.
Less than ideal would be your best friend becomes your pharmacist, right?
Yes.
You're taking so many meds. You know how many seniors I see in the office that they are on 10, 15, or more medication? I'm not kidding you. Every medication almost that you can think of, from cholesterol to heart to blood thinners to sleeping pills to you name it, they're on. I mean, it is incredible. So I don't want my best friend to be my pharmacist. I really don't. Right.
And as
that's
you
so
mentioned,
ideal. That's what my goal would be.
Now, the thing is, there's obviously that's bad, but there's one thing that's even worse, and that's dying early. Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, so where you're at now, think of ideal, think of bad, as we just talked about, and then think of even worse off. You just don't make it. You die of a heart attack, or you die earlier than you are planning on dying. So think of that situation. Now, here's the thing. Where you're at now to get to that ideal is uphill. The line is up. It's not straight across. You can't just necessarily continue doing the things you're doing today, and that will guarantee that you're going to have an ideal 70s, 80s, and 90s. Because it's uphill. You got to be eating the right foods. You got to be getting enough sleep. You got to be getting the right nutrients. You got to be getting the right kind of exercise. And you better be living a relatively stress-free life. Those are the steps. Really, those are the 5 things that kind of dictate what our 70s, 80s, and 90s are going to be like. So, on the other hand, to go down to the bad scenario, or even the really bad scenario, all it takes is some inflammation. All it takes is some high insulin or leaky gut that gets out of control that creates more inflammation. And then next thing you know, you're on that bad path, right? And so now most people that are listening to this, they are heading on that wrong direction. They're heading down that slope, down that bad results. They're heading towards heart disease, which, over half the American adults or Canadian adults have some form of heart disease, right?
Yeah. 50%, yeah.
And then you've stated this before. What percentage of people are metabolically healthy? Less than
12%.
Yeah.
88% are unhealthy metabolically, which is all the precursors, right, to the same things we talk about, to diabetes. It's a precursor to
heart disease and
cancer, and these are all precursors because metabolic syndrome are.
So 88% of the people listening are heading down towards a less than ideal outcome.
Yeah. 12% or less are healthy metabolically.
And I like that one, that one proverb, that one Chinese proverb, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today, right? So if you're listening to this episode and you're like, all right, I would like to have I'd like to have an ideal, end of my life. I got to take the necessary steps, which requires
it's investment,
action.
Right?
Absolutely.
It's investment.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
There's always sacrifice involved.
So the first thing that you have to do, in our opinion, in order to get to that ideal situation is you have to know where you're at right now. That is, for a lot of things in life, you have to know where you're at, because then you can know where you got to go. So that's what we're going to talk about. So what we've done over the years is we've found that there are essentially 4 stages that take place between health and disease. Because as we've mentioned, you don't go to bed healthy and wake up diseased. There are actually 4 stages from health to disease. And everyone listening to this episode is in one of those 4 stages. So we'd like to help people figure out what stage they're in, because when they know what stage they're in, then when we talk about, okay, what do you do now, you can kind of go based off the stage you're in, and it's pretty easy that way, right? So, all right, so let's talk about the 4 stages. Well, the first stage is what we call the state of well-being. The person is healthy, right? And you and I, we've talked about this, and we talked about it on the webinar last night. Getting a definition of health is not that easy because it depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
And we've asked a lot of different healthcare professionals over the years, a lot of different types of people, and we get a lot of different kind of answers about what healthy is. A lot of doctors would say a lack of disease or
absence of symptoms.
Yeah, that's right. Or the lab tests are normal. So you could feel crappy, go to your doctor, get blood tests, and your doctor would say, well, everything's normal, you're healthy, right? And the person's thinking, well, I don't feel healthy. So is that the definition of health? Of course, that's not the definition of health.
And to some extent, and I don't want to be negative through and through, but and I think medicine got hijacked. You and I talk about this. We talked about this ad nauseum, but like medicine got hijacked by labs, right? We talked about that labs become everything. Whereas functional medicine, the lab's important. It's not that we ever dismiss the lab, but the lab and the patient, how they're feeling. Because, my dad used to say, well, patients have inside information, listen to them. And the problem is now doctors are busy and they don't listen. They let me look at your lab test. Oh, your thyroid's good. We talked about that so many times. So medicine has got hijacked by the labs, and so doctors are not using their instincts like they used to, and listening to patients, asking the right questions, because we're question asker. And the second thing is that pharmaceutical industries had a major effect on them, because they're just writing out prescriptions without, anyway. When it comes to ideal health, a lot of times people are put on a path, and they're
told they're healthy,
and
they're on the path to disease because they're, by all accounts, objectively blood test wise, nothing's showing up. They don't feel great, but there's nothing showing up, so they're healthy, but they're on that road. And so so you ask a doctor, they'll talk about their version of health, and there's a lot of different versions. For us, when we look at health, you and I, we've kind of defined someone who's healthy that, first of all, has vibrant energy. They feel fantastic.
Yeah.
Great energy.
Yep.
Doesn't mean you have to have it 7 days a week, 365 days a year, but I'm saying for the most part,
they feel very good.
They're not lacking energy.
Yeah.
Energy is
what an indicator it is.
Oh, right? it is, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but it is a tremendous check engine light indicator. So that's the first thing. A person that is healthy has generally vibrant energy, right? Their energy is good. The second indication that we like to use is what we call biological age. The person is aging slower than the norm, right? So there is a chronological age, which is how old you are on this earth. I'm 46, so my chronological age is 46. Biological age is a whole different thing. That's the insides. How old are my cells? How old is all the stuff inside of me? Which, there are a lot of people in their 60s that have a biological age of 40s, and there are a lot of people in their 40s that have a biological age of 60s. We have people coming in, people in their 70s, they get down on the table and they hop up like nothing, and then we have people in their 40s who can barely do a push-up to get up off the table. They can barely get off, which is why one of the best all-cause mortality indicators is still to get up from the floor, right?
Yeah.
If you can get up from the floor without having to grab 15 things, all-cause mortality, you're going to live longer, generally speaking, than somebody who can't, right? So that's a good indication.
Yeah, you become very frail when you're not.
So biological age is something that, again, a person should look younger than they are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they should feel younger than they are, and they should behave in a sense. They should be able to move around younger than they are. So that's another indicator of health, is that. Also, another one would be little to no inflammation. We don't think a person could be 100% inflammation-free because we think that's a natural a reaction that takes place inside of our body over every little scenario that can possibly occur.
Sure, and you got the environment, unless you're
plastics,
leaving the planet.
are we breathing plastics, right, and all these kind of things.
We live in a crazy world today. It's not the same.
So you're going to have inflammation. So we would say little to no inflammation, and then, of course, we would also say the absence of symptoms as well. A person, and we're going to talk about different symptoms, but that's our definition of health. So that's stage one. If you're experiencing those things,
vibrant,
you're in the first stage of well-being, as we call it. But the next stage, so what happens? How does a person go from being healthy to move into that second stage, which we call the check engine light stage? The second stage, what happens? Well, you and I, we've done this before. We call it the 3 seeds of disease, which the very foundation, the first seed that gets planted in a healthy person that starts to bring them from health to disease, we think there are 3 main ones. So we talk about the 3 seeds of disease, which are leaky gut syndrome, and there are a lot of things that can cause leaky gut syndrome. The other one would be high circulating insulin. There's a lot of things that can cause high circulating insulin, mainly crappy carbs.
Yeah.
Eating way too much in the day and eating way too often in the day can lead to insulin issues, which would lead to high circulating insulin. And the third one of that 3 seeds would be free radical damage. Those 3 things are one by themselves, but usually they play with each other, leads to inflammation, and it grows inflammation. And then that's when the problems start. So as that happens, you end up going from the first stage of being healthy, and you slide a little bit into what we call stage 2, which is the check engine stage. Now, the check engine stage is interesting because that's when people start to experience things like a little bit lower energy, or they may start to gain a little bit of weight, or their brain might not be quite as sharp as it used to be.
Yeah, they got brain fog, or their short-term memory can be affected.
And sleep. All of a sudden they get a little bit of insomnia. They're not sleeping anymore. Or their skin or their hair is starting to give them issues. Their hair is falling out or getting thinner. Or they start to get allergies that they never had before. They get sensitive to foods. They start to get some digestive issues. This is the stage. We call them check engine lights because, again, just like in your car, when your check engine light goes on, it can mean a lot of different things. It's tough to know what the cause of a check engine light unless you get direction. After you plug a little computer in, it tells you what's going on. But when your check engine light goes on in your car, it could be anything. It could be, as I said last night, I found out the hard way. I didn't tighten my gas cap after filling it up. You didn't click it, right? You got to turn to click. They put that on there because of me, because I didn't turn to click, and my check engine light went on. And then my buddy who's a mechanic says, yeah, it had airflow and all that kind of stuff. All right. Or it could be very serious.
Transmission or...
Yeah. Could be like your engine...
No more oil.
Yeah, you're in trouble. So when we say... We call these check engine lights because when somebody comes in or somebody says, well, my energy's low, well, there's a lot of things that can cause that. That's a check engine light. There's a lot of biochemical, hormonal systems in the body that can cause a person to experience low energy. It doesn't point to anything specifically. Same with weight gain. There's a lot of things that can happen where a person starts to gain weight for no other reason. The fact that they could be simple as stress, or it could be hormones. There's so many factors. But that's why we call this stage the check engine light, because people in this stage, when all of a sudden they're going along, they feel good. Then for a while, they don't have as much energy. They book an appointment to go see their doctor. The doctor runs a bunch of tests. The tests come back, and the doctor's like, you're healthy. There's nothing, maybe a little of this or a little bit of anemia or whatever. But for the most part, no, your numbers are good.
Yeah.
So they're in that check engine stage, and we call it the check engine stage as well. And we want to let people know that they are taking a step towards disease at this point. They're on that journey. And they're starting to create the conditions in the body where disease can start to grow and start to cause some issues. So that's that first stage that we like to talk about. Now, from a clinical standpoint, they go get their blood test done, and generally speaking, everything's back. But here's what, from a functional healthcare standpoint, this is what, from a biomarker standpoint, this is what's happening. Inflammation is starting to creep up.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, they don't have optimized levels of vitamin B12, vitamin D, or even DHA for that matter. Oxidative stress is going up. Insulin is starting to go up. They have leaky gut. And usually cortisol is starting to creep up as well. They're starting to have some cortisol cycle or pattern issues, right? So that's what's going on at this stage here. So it's fascinating. But again, they're most of the time they go get their stuff and everything's good, but they don't feel great. This is also the point now where if they, again, don't address the underlying causes, which are the 3 C's, free radical damage, high circulating insulin, or leaky gut, they now take a step more towards disease because what happens is inflammation continues to grow at this point. They're now creating inflammation. Inflammation is starting to grow, and the longer that they stay in that check engine light stage, the more they start sliding to the right towards disease. And then they get into that third stage, which you and I have called the diagnosed symptom stage, because this is the stage where, well, first of all, the same symptoms they had on check engine light they have, but some of them are getting worse. They're more fatigued. They're having more of a hard time sleeping. They're gaining more weight. Their hair's starting to fall out more, or all those symptoms are starting to go more. But now they also start to develop symptoms that you can point to, meaning they got high blood pressure.
Very common.
Very common. That's right. Or you can point to lab values in the lab and say, well, see, you got high triglycerides, or now you're starting to get hyperinsulinemia, or you're starting to get uric acid, or now some of your panels are going off, right? You start to have, or you got metabolic syndrome, or you got pre-diabetes, or you
liver enzymes or whatever can be starting to go up. And
exactly, and we call this the
diagnosable.
And this is, as you've mentioned this, well, we'll get into that in a second, but so they'll come in. This is the stage where people say, "Hey, I got pain now, right? I got pain. I got gout. I got psoriasis. I got my prostate starting to. I got BPH. I got PCOS. I got thyroid issues.
ED.
Exactly. This is the stage where you start to have diagnosable symptoms. They're not a disease yet, but you got symptoms like high blood pressure is not a disease.
It's a symptom.
It's a symptom of something else, but you got high blood pressure, right? So this is the stage, and as you've mentioned, this is also the stage when people start to get on medication.
Yeah, and you see a lot of that, right, where people are now, instead of addressing the issue, they're actually taking a medication. So blood pressure, again, it's a symptom. So if you're taking a blood pressure medication, we're not telling you not to take it. We're just saying that you're not really addressing the issue. What caused you to have high blood pressure, right? So the inflammation within the blood vessels, the restriction, nutrient deficiency, oftentimes with low levels of vitamin D, B12, and whatever. We had talked about this, even low levels of magnesium can affect and give you the high blood pressure. But you're starting down that. Now you're really on the path, right? And again, the medications are not meant to fix. They're meant to mask. They are there to generally, and they'll always say, well, if you're on a high blood pressure med, your blood pressure came down, so now stay on it.
Yeah, it's the catch-22 because they're like, well, hey, you went on blood pressure medication, your blood pressure came down, that's awesome, you better stay on it because it's working.
Yeah.
Or you go on blood pressure medication, it's not coming down, they're like, well, you better stay on it because we got to bring it down because it's not coming down. Yeah. So we better up the levels. And I'll tell you, there are very few people who feel fantastic when they're taking blood pressure medications. They just don't feel good. Yeah. Their energy's down. I mean, they're bleeding B6 and B12. It's affecting, they just don't feel good. Yeah. And what's interesting, and again, 5-year studies on people that go on blood pressure medication or don't. There was a large meta-analysis done, and I'll tell you, there's no difference in mortality. The only thing is that people on the medication felt worse. Again, we're not telling people not to go on medication. We're saying that they're treating a symptom, and it's not working.
Yeah, it's not working.
There's nobody that goes on a high blood pressure medication that all of a sudden saves himself from heart disease because that's one symptom. That's all we're saying.
Yeah.
But this is the stage when they do that. Now they're in the third stage. So if you're taking medication or you've got a diagnosed symptom like we've mentioned, right, there's a whole bunch of different ones. You are now in that third stage. And here's the thing. You are now approaching what you and I call the now or never zone because they are almost at the point of disease.
Yeah, point of no return.
It's the point of no return.
Mm-hmm.
And then when somebody gets to that point of no return and they cross it, they enter into the disease state. Now they're in a diseased state. That's a whole different ballgame. Also, you are now moving from the concept of prevention to the concept of actual treatment. So again, big difference. Prevention is always best, but prevention for a lot of people isn't interesting. They'll deal with it when they get it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's how
Especially
it is.
men.
They always say this, and we wrote a book on cancer, and we've written a lot of books. And of all the books we've written, the cancer book was the least bestseller that we had. And we found out, and we were told this ahead of time, it didn't matter. People are really only interested about cancer until once they get it. When they get cancer or somebody else does, then they want to know about it. But before that,
it's not.
It's
sexy.
like saving for retirement. It's hard to tell a 20-year-old to worry about retirement when they're in their 20s. They just don't think about it. And as humans, it's fascinating, right? We are guided by a very strong psychological principle, and the principle is this: because it hasn't happened, it won't happen, right? And we do that all the time for many things, right? Because this has never happened, it won't happen, and that's how we are with cancer.
I remember a lawyer told me once. Clients would come in to do their will, and they said, well, we're coming here to do a will if we die. And he said, no, when you die. No, if I die, here's my will. And I used to just die laughing literally about, that's kind of funny because that's the way people are.
That's
right?
how we are.
Human psychology 101.
And it's good. In a lot of ways, it protects us from a lot of things because we don't walk through life scared of everything. But generally speaking, prevention is a tough sell. Most people, there are a percentage of people that feel great and take supplements and exercise, and that's awesome, right? But a large part of the population, and those that are listening to this podcast know this, if they got family members or friends, they're trying to get them to do something health-wise. It's hard to get people to do things because prevention is just not one of those things that people care too much about, because if that was the case, everybody would be flossing and doing all those things, right? That's just not how we are. So that's what's going on here.
You go against the norm if you're really into prevention, right?
And then, so once you cross that now or never, the point of no return, you are now fully in the disease state. So now you've been diagnosed with some form of heart disease or diabetes or some kind of fatty liver, cancer or whatever. You were diagnosed. You are now in the diseased state. So that's the 4 stages. So if you're listening, the first thing we want you to do is sit there and think, okay, what stage am I in? Most people listening to this podcast, most people are in between stages 2 and 3. Some of you got diabetes, you're in 4th stage. But most people listening are somewhere between 2 and 3.
Yeah.
And the reason why we want people to know that is because of a few things. First of all, if you're in that first stage, right, you're healthy. Well, you want to stay healthy. So as we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, it's an uphill line to get to where you want to go when you're older. So you have to live a low insulin lifestyle, right? You have to keep insulin low. You have to get the right amount of sleep. You have to keep your stress levels low. You have to do some form of strength training, build muscle. You need muscle to age well. So you better be putting on some muscle, taking the right supplements to cover those nutrients. That's how you stay in that healthy stage, right? But now that you kind of have an idea what stage you're in, and here's what we tell people when it comes to eating, dietary-wise. The carb tolerance scale that you and I use, it's very simple. The further you are on the path towards disease, the less you are able to tolerate carbs.
Yeah.
In our experience. I mean, listen, there's exceptions to every rule.
But not many.
Meaning, if you're in that disease state or you're in that diagnosed symptom state, you have to go on that low end of carbs to do well. to kind of help get the nutrients to eat to feel better. Because every time you're eating, you're either, promoting health or hurting health. You're either causing a cascade of hormonal responses in favor of health, or you're causing inflammation, right? The further you are along the path to disease, the more strict you have to be all the time.
Yeah.
It's so much easier when somebody's in that check engine stage because they don't have to be nearly as strict, because they every bite's not going to kill them, literally. Whereas if they're in a disease,
they can do more cheating, right? They can have more carbohydrates, and they get away with it much more. But if you're
a diabetic,
you're a diabetic. I tell diabetic patients,
they can't cheat.
You can't cheat. You got an allergy, man. You got an allergy to carbohydrate. You and carbs are no. You might be frenemy. You like them, but they don't like you.
No, they're stabbing in the back whenever they can.
Yeah, and they're making you very unwell.
Heart disease, same thing. Heart disease, you're creating if you have heart disease, you do not want to be creating inflammation every time you eat.
Yeah.
You definitely don't want to be doing that. So that's why
and
you have
don't
to be
want,
way
you
more
got to
strict.
get your triglycerides down, and you got to get your good cholesterol up. And it's food. And, somebody's like, people try and negotiate with me. Like, I had a diabetic in this morning, and they're trying to negotiate, right? Because I said, look, man, like you got an allergy to carbs. And then they said, well, what about bread? I said, well, that's a carb.
And that's a fast-acting carb.
I said, because it was kind of funny. The guy was...
It's like, and it's so funny because you feel for them too, right? Because, I mean...
he said, how am I going to eat eggs if I can't dip my bread in the eggs, And I'm laughing.
Like eggs or ketchup.
Well, I said, you better get used to it, man, because this is your days of eating toast are over. And I said, only if you want to be healthy, because I said you're already there.
If you want to take insulin all the time, or you want to progressively get worse.
And you know what? Like you always say, diabetes it ends very poorly.
Yeah,
you're on the Titanic.
Yeah, it's not ending well.
The iceberg, you've already hit the side of it.
Yeah, the current system of treatment, and I don't even call it treatment, I call it management of diabetes. Yeah. Everybody who gets on the diabetes train, we know where it ends. It doesn't end well. It ends with heart disease. It ends with vision issues, or they lose their leg.
Loss of limbs.
Yeah, it doesn't end well. So if you want to get off that train, you have to be very strict, which is why it's so much easier to address things early on, because you don't have to be quite as strict. So the carb tolerance scale, somebody that's healthy can generally tolerate more carbs than somebody who is diseased. Somebody that's healthy can tolerate more carbs than somebody in that check engine thing. Yeah. But the carb scale goes down as they get. And then when they're diseased, they're generally, diagnosed symptoms and disease, they're flirting with keto, and then disease, they should be, for a lot of these things, they should be in that keto phase right now. And then obviously you have to be way more strict with your supplements, your exercise, your stress management. All the further along you are, the more strict you have to be. So for a person that doesn't want to be nearly as strict and wants to be able to, more flexibility, get at things early, right? But if you're listening, you're like, I'm in that disease state, or I'm in that third stage. All right, you definitely have to do some work that way. Now, all right, so you know where you're at. You have a general idea of that carbohydrate tolerance in a sense. And again, we have a program on our website that, it's the Serial Killers program. It's a low carb program, but it's a cyclical. There's a whole bunch of things inside of there. That's what we usually recommend for people.
Yeah.
Now, all right. People always ask us also, okay, I'm not sure about supplements. I don't know where to start when it comes to supplements. Well, it's very simple. A majority of the people are the majority of the population. We call it the 80-20 rule, but it's more like the 95-5 rule. A person that goes into stage 2, 3, or 4, they're always going to be deficient in vitamin B12. They're generally going to be deficient in vitamin D. They're going to be low in magnesium, and they're going to have DHA, which is an omega-3 fatty acid. They're going to have
They're in the low levels of those.
They are. And then, because there's the 3 seeds of disease that have to be addressed, a good probiotic for leaky gut, a very good antioxidant. We like pine bark extract and our Navitol for the free radical damage. The high circulating insulin, that's the eating part. Take care of that.
Insulin's food.
And that takes care of the 3 seeds. Then you plug those deficiencies that we just meant. And then if a person comes in and says, all right, I got my road to disease, I'm heading down, I got heart symptoms. Well, you got to address that. somebody says, well, I got hormones, I got thyroid or whatever. Then you get specific, but you got to fix the foundation, got to fix the eating. And then if you're listening to this and you're like, I understand this part here, but I am heading down the road towards heart disease, or I am heading down the road to have some thyroid issues. Well, we have a lot of great videos on our website. Yeah. Full presentations, webinars that we did that are recorded. They're available on our website that you can go there, get them, watch them. We talk about stuff that we do in our clinic. We share as much information as possible so that you can go.
And you can understand it.
Yeah, that's the point. We want people to know where they're at right now and then know what they can do to help themselves get better, and that's the thing, because there's so much misinformation out there. So we try to make it as simple as possible. Again, we covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
This podcast, again, as we mentioned, was based off of a webinar we did. So if you want to see the visuals and you want to hear it again, but with graphs and all that kind of stuff, go to our website. It'll be available on our website. It's the Start Here webinar as well. So again, we want to thank you for listening and have a great day.
You've reached the end of another Doctor is In podcast with your hosts, Dr. Martin Jr. and Sr. Be sure to catch our next episode, and thanks for listening.